Hey everybody, this is Perch. I'm taking a look at 2019 by the numbers to give you a sense of how the comic industry is doing. And I'm doing this for a few reasons, and I'm starting at 2019 and I'm working my way backward. 2020 is a very disruptive year for comics. It's going to be hard to draw accurate analysis around 2020 until we get a couple years beyond it. We have to see where the trends are going. This is why, if you've paid attention to the sales numbers I've done in the past, you'll see that I like the use of trend lines. And I like that because it evens out momentary events. It takes away maybe environmental bumps or things that happen because of a particular gimmick or issue, and it starts to smooth out the picture. And so you can get a better sense of where the industry is heading. But 2019 is an interesting year because, as you've maybe heard me talk about in the past, about every 18 to 20 years, there seems to be a cyclical change in the comic industry. We saw it back in '92. We saw it again in around 2002. So that was about 10 years. And then what we've seen is about this longer run. And clearly the industry is changing. The problem is, I think a lot of people who are looking at the industry are still trying to map it back to what they know or what they trust or what's comfortable. So this, I think, starts to paint the picture of where things have gone right and where things have gone wrong and starts to make some sense. Now, like anything with numbers, you can draw a lot of conclusions from them. I'm trying to put the data up for you to take a look at it yourself. I'll tell you my conclusions, but you may have different ones, and that's totally fine. So obviously 2019 was a year of a lot of change, or as many call it, the year before everything went to complete shit. 2019 had a lot of digital advancements. It had a lot of, obviously, political unrest and power of social media growing, and just a lot of pieces kind of were put into play in 2019 that would then play into comics. Now, as I get into this analysis, here's one very important piece. I'm talking monthly comic books here, not trades, not segments outside of traditional Western regions like manga, YA, or European books. There's a reason for that. This is a lot of data. If I start to pull in all these things, you're going to be here for 2 hours. And I think it's better to just get some data out, and I'll keep doing these every week or so, and we'll get the full picture over time. But the comic industry is absolutely changing. This will help explain a bit by looking closely at traditional monthly comics alone in 2019 and what's happening. So throughout the year, we had a number of pretty big sellers. These were the top 5 books for 2019, led by Batman's Detective Comics 1000, a big anniversary issue, Spawn, also an anniversary issue, the rebooted X-Men #1, Black Cat #1, a little bit of an asterisk there because there were some heavy kind of additional sell-throughs on that book. It wasn't necessarily a true typical bestseller in a comic shop, and then Deceased #1. Only one title, and this is where we start to, I'm going to put these little bits into this video as we go to kind of paint the overall picture. But I'm trying to draw out for you how 2019 was different from previous years, because this is where it starts to get pretty important. I'm going to tell you my conclusion here at the start, and then we'll work through it. 2019, I think, was the first year where a lot of things became unhealthy in the comic industry. And maybe a better way to put it was, some things happened in 2015 and 2016 that really were unhealthy, and it kind of caught up to us in 2019. And you'll see where I'm talking about. But these 3 facts here are pretty big indicators. So only one title, only one, in the top 30 comics was a regular issue. That means an issue that wasn't an anniversary issue, a relaunch, or some kind of limited series or event issue. Only one in the top 30. Now, if you want to go back, and when is the last time this happened, you can't. I went back 25 years. I can't find another time period in the last 25 years where that is true. 17 titles sold more than 150,000 units. Only 17 for the entire year. And 496, so just under 500 titles, sold more than 40,000. Okay? So that's kind of a general state of the industry. So here's a graph that you often see. This has been put in a lot of blogs and other things, and this is called North American comic book sales. And if you look at this, the bars are mostly all going up, with the exception of a little blip in 2017 where things dropped. And this is a graph a lot of people like to point to say, hey, you know, all those people saying the comic industry has problems, clearly it doesn't. Look, all the bars are going up. The problem with this is this chart here is not, it's more than just monthly comics. This is including trades, it's including a lot of other pieces to it. And the trade market and the inclusion of what's happened with manga and some other series are driving this number higher. But this isn't an accurate representation of monthly comic sales. Now, I'll pause here for a moment and say, hey, if you want to claim the comic industry as a whole is healthy, you can look at this picture and I think you could convincingly make that argument. If you want to say that, therefore, monthly comic books are also healthy, you can't. This number rolls a lot of things into it. So let me first show you this picture. This is a more accurate picture for talking monthly comic books. This is unit comic sales from Diamond. These are basically the units that are shipped from Diamond to shops. And what you see is, by contrast, a decline. A decline that's happened in 2015 and 2016. We topped out at 99 million units, and we've been dropping. So we're now at 83 million, and we're basically kind of back to where we were in before 2012 in terms of titles going down. Now, it's getting more stable. That's good news. But overall, the trend is down. So if we look at a trend line here, and this is why, again, I love trend lines, you see how these things are going. If you think about the picture from 2009 to 2019, we're basically up 3,000 units over that entire time. So we've lost a lot of the gains we got when we peaked around 2015 to 2016. But these are unit sales. What about dollars? So dollars gives us a slightly different picture. Here are the dollar sales. Now, how much was actually made? And here we see a little bit of a different picture. What's happened at the end is in 2019, things bumped up again. In fact, even 2017, 2018, there's a tiny little bit of growth. So this is good news, right? Well, when we look at the curve, it certainly kind of somewhat seems so. The trend takes us from 280 million back in 2009 up to a high point of 390 million again in 2015. And then we see that drop, but we're starting to see some recovery back up to 350. That's good news. And so when I combine the two, by the way, this is an interesting little graph to look at. We see the unit sales and the dollar sales. Unit sales in green, dollar sales in blue. All right. Now, here's where I think the picture gets interesting, because you see all this data and it's maybe hard to kind of ascertain what's going on here. Let's just take the two trend lines, the trend line for units, which you saw before, and the trend line for dollars, and we lay them up against each other. Now, what's interesting to view here is what's healthy and unhealthy. So obviously, by pure definition, healthy is when you ship less and profit more. You're making more dollars for what you're shipping. Unhealthy is when you ship more and you profit less. There's a lot of little details in there, but at a very high level, back in the napkin, this is a way you can think about the business. If I then bring my graphs together here and I just draw places where things were less healthy, in 2010 to 2011, the dollars briefly dipped in terms of the dollars were dropping in terms of what was made, where the units were increasing. That means they were shipping more but making less. In 2015, we saw the biggest gap, meaning the gap between units and dollars in terms of trend. Dollars were on the rise, units were starting to flatten out. And in fact, when we get to 2017 and 18, we're still seeing that dollars are higher than units, but dollars are falling at a steeper rate than units. And keep that in mind. This is very important because it brings us to 2019 and that picture where dollars are starting to pick up, units are still descending. Again, this is good news, right? Well, it would be if the price was remaining consistent. So we'll get to this in a moment, but just keep this in mind that we're making more, that's great, but why are we making more? What is causing us to make more? So some initial quick takeaways. We've seen a steady unit decline since 2016. That indicates that 2015 was a jumping off point for some in monthly comics. As you've probably heard from some of these other videos, people just don't stop buying comics, overnight. Things take a while. And generally speaking, it's like a slow motion accident. The car crashes, and then a year later, you see the impacts of that accident. Now, keep in mind, I don't want to be hyperbolic here. I'm not trying to say the entire comics industry is a crashed car or anything like that, but you do see some worrying things. The big two, and here we say mostly Marvel. they're largely publishing and shipping more units to decreasing dollars obtained. And you'll see a clearer picture of that in a moment, but they're shipping more and getting less overall for what they were shipping. There were price hikes in 2013 and around 2012, 2013. That's happening again in 2019, but at a much more aggressive rate. And we're seeing a gap. So back to that initial picture where we see everything is just going up, what we're seeing is the gap between the monthly comic business and things like OGNs and trade paperbacks and manga and YA. That gap is getting wider and wider and wider at almost an exponential rate. So put another way, what we're seeing is a heavier reliance in 2019 of higher priced comics in order to maintain a flat or slightly higher trajectory of sales. In unit sales, the number of books shipped out is in a steady decline, even though more books are being produced. Oh, so what does this mean? It means that the publishers are making more books than they've made in the past. They're actually doing more, but fewer of them are moving to shops. So here we're going to look very quickly at kind of month by month. So if we look at January to March, Q1 of 2019, these are the books. You see January column or a row there, February a row, March a row. We see the different books. This is what's selling. And if you look at the books that were in the top 5 each month, DC had 10 of them and Marvel had 5. Now this is an interesting thing again to keep in mind. What you're going to see for 2019 is that DC largely held more of the top spots than Marvel did, something that I bet most of you wouldn't have expected. If we look at January, this is a breakdown of the units that were sold, showing all the different companies, including companies like Antarctic and Dark Horse and Boom and Action Lab and Aspen and Mad Cave and all of them. And we're seeing the #1 issues. Now we're going to look more at this in a moment, but what to pay attention to here is the units sold, the average price, and what you're seeing is even though DC is dominating kind of the top in January, you are seeing basically that Marvel is moving more units. Now, why is that? They're basically shipping a lot more comics. And the other alarming thing here, and we'll move through all the other months a little quicker, is that Marvel had 40 #1 issues, or 32% of their line was a #1 issue. Now, some people might point out, well, wait a minute, some of those are reprints, and you're right. I'm going to show the data in a moment that excludes the reprints, but for the moment, it's good to show them because whether it's a reprint or not, this is still a comic that the comic shop is being asked to buy or order, put on the shelves, and sell. Whether it's a True Believer issue or a reprint or whatever it happens to be, this is still a physical good the company's wanting you to buy. Excluding the reprints is interesting from the standpoint of what is truly new, but it's all volume of comics out the door. So as we look at February and March, we see similar pictures here, and those have been flashing on the screen as I've gone. When we look at Q2, we see basically DC still has a pretty good stranglehold on the top 5 in April, May, and June. They've got 9 of the 15 top comics, whereas Marvel has 6. But this is where we are starting to get War of the Realms and kind of other big events that in the past have been a big deal for Marvel. So we look at April and the units sold. In particular, in April, you see a huge gap between Marvel and DC. But once again, 56 #1 issues in April, 43 in May, and 49 in June. Now, why do I keep hammering on this #1 issue thing? Well, because as you see historically with the trends and the entire thing we've been going on here, Marvel is moving more and more to a #1 and event-driven line. When we get to Q3, July to September, we see Marvel really dominate, and they dominated for really 2 reasons. Really one reason. House of X Powers of 10. There were 6 titles in the top, in the 15 books for the 3 months. 16 titles that dominated the charts. And then on top of that, you had Absolute Carnage, you had the Marvel Comics 1000 special, you had the Spider-Man with J.J. Abrams, you had Spawn come in at issue 300, and the conclusion to Walking Dead. All this meant that Marvel took 10 of the 15 spots, DC took 3, and Image took 2. And as you look at July, again, very similar breakdowns of units sold and price. Marvel was moving a lot of comics out the door. Finally, we get to Q4, October to December. DC rebounds a little bit, but the X titles are definitely carrying the way. And what's interesting is the X books were so dominant for Marvel in 2019 that if you take them out of the mix and you don't include the X books at all in Marvel's figures, which wouldn't be completely fair because they were publishing X books before this, but the growth of that Hickman line and what they did basically gave Marvel about a 20% lift for the second half of the year. It was very significant. Take them out, they look much worse. So if we look at October, November, and December, what we see is a very X-dominated world, even though you did have things like Doomsday Clock, you had the Batman Last Night on Earth issue come out, a few other things, the Dark Knight Returns. But all in all, it was a first half of the year that was largely dominated by DC, and a second half of the year that was definitely Marvel came back. So some observations. If Marvel had not published the X books, they would have had a significantly down year. Like Marvel would have looked pretty bad. And by contrast, if DC had not published anniversary issues, they would have had a significantly down revenue year. Now, why that extra word revenue? Well, a lot of those anniversary issues were clocking in at $10 or a much higher price point overall. And that was driving DC's overall picture quite a bit. In terms of the smaller guys, Dynamite and Boom made significant progress, but in very different ways. Dynamite made a lot of progress through a large amount of variants and different cover options that they put out. Boom actually got a lot of new comics on the ground, off the ground, and they showed steady growth throughout the entire year, something you're going to see in a second. Image held ground, and arguably Image had the most stable year. They lost Walking Dead, and they lost some of the other pieces, and Spawn definitely tilted the picture a lot because issue 300 did so well from a shipping standpoint. But by and large, Image seemed to solidify their business to some extent, something that's probably helping them out now during the what would transpire in 2020 in the pandemic. So now we're going to look at the total comics published by month in 2019. And this is a bit of a horrifying picture. Now, once again, this does include reprints. We'll show you the numbers without it in a second. But basically, Marvel, every month of the year, published higher than 120 comics each month, once you include reprints. When you get into things like June and September, the True Believers line and the reprints basically got them close to 200 comics. DC was, less than half of that. And why this is important is this is how Marvel really tried to dominate the stands. And again, yes, this is including reprints, it's including True Believers, it's including all that kind of stuff, but it's all volumes of comics being put out. Marvel's strategy is clear on the page. They are stuffing the shelves. That's what they're doing. I mean, there's some moments there where Image is actually quite close to DC in terms of volume of comics put out. And this is important to realize and remember as we go into 2021, and we've talked about DC cutting back on their line and everything else. This is what the picture looked like. If we looked at the average units sold by publisher, DC is there in the orange, Marvel is there in the blue. Now your immediate takeaway should be, well, wait a minute, Marvel is pumping out way more comics than DC. Why are they below them? Well, it's simple. Basically, DC was able to make more money, or basically ship more units off of their comics than Marvel. But the other thing to pull in here is look at the chart on the side. Basically, Marvel never gets above 30,000 average. As of all the comics they sell, they're under 30,000 on average per issue. Obviously, some issues did better, some issues did worse. That's what an average is. Marvel's under 30,000. DC is just a little bit better than that. DC's under 32,000. And you see where Image and others are. The thing to take away here is that Boom grew steadily almost month after month. Boom took their world from averaging around 6,000 issues to getting close to 10. Sounds like a small number, but that's almost double. That's great news for Boom. Dynamite had a similar growth. Again, a lot of that was based on a lot of variant covers and other things. IDW had a tough year where they ended almost where they began. And it's interesting to look at. But again, think about the amount of comics shipped and then the end result here with the numbers where Marvel and DC are concerned. And I'm going to show you one more chart here before we get then firmly into the numbers of comics published without reprints and things. This is comic books in the top 25 in 2019. Marvel being blue, DC being orange. What you see is DC's, basically standing in the top 25 was eroded as the year went on, and Marvel's grew, and that almost all of that from July to December is due to Hickman and the X-Men relaunch. That's what changed the game for Marvel. That's why when we talk about, and even me, I complain about all the X books and all the spin-offs and all the, why are they keeping going back to the well with the X-Men? Well, this is why. The X-Men largely turned the world around for them. They took their first year and changed it up pretty big. By the way, the same thing can be true with Batman. If you take Batman out of the mix, DC becomes dismal in terms of publishing. They start to, if you take DC out of the mix, then, if you take Batman out of the mix for DC, it starts to look a lot like Image very, very fast. So why are we getting so many Batman books? Why are we getting so many X-Men books? That's what's carrying their line right now. Okay, so believe it or not, now we're getting to the kind of the interesting part. It's weird to say that when we're like 20 minutes into this thing, but here are the total comics published every month when we take out reprints. And what you see is, Marvel kind of sits in the 90s for much of the year, from April to December. DC doesn't do the same amount of reprints and other kind of special things that Marvel does, but still they're hovering around there in the 60s. And Image is down there more or less for comparison's sake. Now let's look at some trends of what happened for the year. Basically Marvel, largely they do their events in the summer. You saw them bump up and then come back down, but basically they ended the year publishing more comics than when they started it. And DC kind of had the opposite. They had a very inverse kind of picture. They declined during the summer and then started to come back up again toward the end of the year. As we've talked about DC only having 52 comics, it's interesting to see that like 88 and 79 and 71 in there. It is interesting to see that there's more comics here than you might have expected. In fact, in October, we had 99 comics to Marvel to 88 comics from DC. Image is on a slow decline for the year. Not anything really aggressive, but they basically are publishing less. But here's the thing. You would expect that Image, because they do comics in limited series, they tend to do bursts like that. They don't have as many ongoings. They have some, but basically it's more of a home for these kind of smaller run series. This picture is not that weird for Image. Now, what does this look like? Well, there's a 13% increase for Marvel, an 8% decrease for DC, and a 27% decrease for Image in terms of total comics published each month. By the way, as we go through this, if you think about Marvel as the blue line, DC as the orange line, it's going to make a lot of this very, very simple. Average units sold by publisher. Now that we're taking out the reprints, we get a picture that, again, paints at least the story that DC was doing better. At the first half of the year, Marvel seemed to overtake it right at the middle of the year. Again, a lot of that has to do with the X-Men, but both Marvel and DC are averaging less than 40,000 units per month. So if we look at this trend, we see Marvel, again, you see the X-Men bump and what it does for it. It also paints the picture that if you get a hot new comic, like House of X Powers of 10 was, it's really a couple months later before you really start to see it impact the line. That's why the trend line gets to be so useful. DC, you see an overall interesting curve, and Image is fairly flat. What does this mean? Well, over the year, Marvel had a 6% decrease in their average units sold. DC was, at the end of the day, flat. And Image saw a 2% increase, a very small increase. Now, this is an interesting picture. So what does this mean? Well, Marvel published 13% more comics. They trended 13% more as the year went on, but they actually sold 6% less. That's the opposite of what you want as a business. DC had a healthier-ish picture. They basically published 8% fewer comics through the year, and they, in effect, had no change in units sold. Image is the picture of health in this perspective, in that they published 27% fewer comics. They trended 27% less over the year, but they increased 2%. So basically, they produced fewer comics, but sold a little bit more. That's what you'd want. Now, we want to look at the average cost of comics by publisher, because this is an important picture too. And what we see is both Marvel and DC at least from the visual here, seem to be going up. Is that what happens? Well, yes. Marvel increases from $4.17 to $4.38 by the time the year is run. Now, keep in mind, this is the average comic. So this is taking all the anniversary issues, the monthly issues. It's giving us an average price of what things are worth. DC is an interesting picture because they go from $4.05 to $4.60 on average. And Image, yeah, it goes up a little bit, but really nothing to write home about. What does this mean? Well, DC had a 12% increase in costs. Now, this makes complete sense. They started doing a lot more anniversary issues in 2019. They started doing more Black Label books. Basically, their average cost went up, and of the units they were selling more of those expensive titles too. Marvel had a 5% increase in average comic cost, Image 3%. So what does this mean? Well, now bringing this stat into the picture, Marvel published more, sold less, but increased their cost 5%. DC published less, they sold the same. That's maybe good news, it's kind of flat news, but they had a 12% increase in cost. Image published much less, sold much more, only had a 3% increase in cost. So all this basically tells us is if we look at the health, this is not a healthy picture. Now, this is not me saying the bottom's dropping out from under comics. Comics are all bad. The comics quality is bad. That's kind of irrelevant. If you're enjoying the X-Men, for example, you're enjoying the X-Men. These numbers don't mean anything to you. But in terms of the health of the industry, for the monthly comics, Marvel is having to publish more in order to sell the same or less than what they were. And they've raised price a bit. DC's picture is equally alarming, but in a different way. They're publishing less, but their sales are relatively flat, and they're having to increase their price pretty significantly. 12% over the course of a year is a significant overall line increase. And Image is more or less trucking along fairly solidly. So now let's take a look back at this #1 issues. We touched on this a little earlier, but this is where I feel, once again, you can gauge things as being unhealthy. Marvel just strips away everyone by the amount of #1 issues. And here in this picture, we have taken out the reprints. These are truly new comics being sold. In 1 month, in July, 33 #1 issues. That is a ludicrous number. There is no way that you can wrap your head around that in any kind of sane world, but it does tell you that the comic business is changing. Marvel's strategy is very, very different. We are not living in any kind of monthly ongoing world with Marvel. The numbers are irrelevant. Some might claim that that's been that way for a while, but in 2019, it's the first year things really, the wheels came off the bus, and this is how they started publishing comics. If we look at across the 3 brands, and again, I use Image here as kind of a baseline. Marvel published, are you ready for this? 258 #1 issues in 2019 alone. 258. 24% of their entire line, not counting True Believer issues and reprints, were #1. Almost a quarter of everything they did was a #1 issue. DC published 90 #1 issues, which in any kind of world would be, cause for, alarm. But making up 11% of their entire line, that's a lot of comics. And Image, 35, 9%. Here's the thing. It makes sense again for Image. Image publishes by intent, by mandate, a lot of smaller series, limited series, self-contained stories. You would expect Image's #1 issues to, frankly, be higher. I would expect Image to be more around 40 to 50% based on the kind of comics that they sell. But Image publishes the fewer amount of #1 issues by percentage of their line than Marvel or DC. And if you want to visualize this, here's a good way to think about it. Here's 10 comics sold. So for out of every 10 comics each company is selling, here's what it looks like for #1 issues. 2.5 out of Marvel, 1 and a bit out of DC, and kind of 1 out of Image. But here's what happens when you add in the events and the limited series quickly. You are at almost 6 out of every 10 issues Marvel sells is either a #1 issue or an event or a limited series. Almost 6 out of 10. That's a huge amount. And what it means is there is more disposable comics running out to the field. And we know this by looking at the earlier numbers, we're producing a lot more comics and they're selling overall a lot less. One of the reasons you do an ongoing series, if you're one of the big two, is because people are going to continue to buy it and collect it over time. Even if they don't particularly like a creator or part of the run, they're just going to continue to buy it because they want to hold on to their collector market. Now, we've heard a lot of people say, well, the collector market is a dying market and the comic industry needs to change. You're not wrong. But here's the thing, the growth is not happening for Marvel or DC. By doing these limited series and things like this, they are not seeing the uptick in their trades and graphic novels line. That's going to manga, it's going to YA, it's going to Scholastic, it's going to other people. So Marvel has largely shifted their strategy, whether they're admitting it or not, they've shifted kind of how they're putting out comics, but we're not seeing that strategy pay off. Now, some observations here. In 2019, like I said, we saw a dramatic increase in specialized non-ongoing titles, especially from Marvel. But despite that, their trending sales still dropped. Traditional publishing strategies were largely abandoned in favor of short-term bumps of titles and a heavy reliance on gimmicks and anniversary issues, particularly with DC, who in particular embraced higher-selling anniversary issues, but saw the bulk of their line decline in overall units sold. Remember, their dollar sales basically stayed flat, but they put out a lot more anniversary issues and special issues and gimmick issues, and that is a challenge because it means that everything else, if it remains flat, everything underneath had to have dropped, and it did. The big two publishers worked harder to maintain a steady trend or actually declined. Image actually proved the traditional model can work. Of all the publishers, Image kind of really just hunkered down. And as I mentioned before, and I'm paying a lot of attention here to Marvel, DC, and Image, but Boom and some others also just went in for traditional publishing models, and it paid off. Now, we're going to return to this picture. Remember this graph line? And remember, we're trying to figure out what's the picture of 2019 look like. Basically, the summary is, in 2019, Marvel published more, sold less, and raised costs. DC published a little less, sold the same, and raised costs. Neither of these things are what I would call healthy in the industry. Yet still there's that tick up. Well, that tick up has a lot to do with two things. Anniversary issues, particularly driven by Detective Comics, and special limited series like Deceased and the Powers of X House of 10. You take those out of the picture, and that dollar sale drops. Actually drops pretty fast. So put another way, monthly comic sales are sliding. To combat that, we're seeing more events, more #1 issues, gimmicks, and price increase. It is helping revenue, but not by much, and unit sales are still declining. Remember in that earlier picture, the units are still on a downward trend, even if dollars have dipped back up again. All that means is a couple comics are selling more and they're priced higher, but the overall line is still in decline. Now, how did we get here? This is where, as we go through this is 2019, and I'm going to march backward in time. So I want to pay attention to 2015 and Secret Wars #1. More and more, there is clear numerical evidence that says that Secret Wars was a conclusion of sorts to a lot of Marvel fans. We went from Secret Wars to Civil War II to Secret Empire. And during that same time period, between 2015 and 2018, we have 4 separate Marvel kind of initiative relaunches. We had All New, All Different. We had the Divided We Stand, Marvel Now. We had Marvel Legacy, and then we had Marvel Fresh Start during this time period. If I put it up against our calendar, this is what things look like, including both Marvel and DC. Now, notice what happens here. In 2012, as things were starting to grow, well, actually, we can go back to 2011. We saw the New 52 get launched. We saw Avengers versus X-Men as a major initiative. We saw the very first kind of Marvel relaunch or Marvel marketing initiative happen in 2012. And then for a couple years, we saw healthy growth from those two things. The New 52 carried quite a bit for DC, and kind of the excitement around both the Avengers movie and AVX and these other things was successful. Then in 2015, we saw a couple things. We saw convergence from DC, and we saw Secret Wars #1. We also continued to see more Marvel relaunches. And in 2015, we saw the peak, and we saw things start to tip out. In 2016, we saw this complete reimagining of both a lot of the Marvel characters as they changed up a lot of the core heroes that people recognized. We saw Civil War II, which was a dud of an event. And then we saw this continue to happen in 2017, where, midway through, DC did do Rebirth, which seemed to help their company a bit, but Marvel did Secret Empire and continued to relaunch their line, and the numbers continued to fall. This leads us to 2019, which was War of the Realms and a lot of legacy issues and a lot of anniversary issues. Overall, how did we get here? Well, there was a significant impact, a negative impact that happened with monthly comics and the stories that were being told around 2015 to 2016. And there were a number of factors. A lot of people point to, hey, there is this new diverse roster that Marvel put in place. But that's just kind of part of the picture. It doesn't actually tell the full story. More than that, I'm convinced much more than that, you saw a lot of creators leave. You saw a lot of established names that people would show up to buy comics from move on to other companies. You saw basically a lot of titles get relaunched and rebooted. You saw events come in and interfere. Secret Wars disrupted all the comics. That caused a lot of people to question if they wanted to keep buying those comics, and they decided not to. Also, you saw Civil War II come in, which both felt like a cash grab, kind of because it was, and you saw a lot of further changing to core characters. You gave a lot of people a lot of reasons to leave. Now, we can all point to saying, well, it was because of Riri Williams or it's because of Miss Marvel. Not really. It has a lot more to do with talent went out the door, a lot of big names left, and a lot of the Marvel Universe that people recognized went away. Whether they were legacy characters or new characters, it didn't really matter. The characters were not recognizable. That's the problem. Even the comics that had, quote unquote, the heroes we've always known no longer felt like the comics we had prior to 2015. And so we saw people step out. And so what you've seen since then is a lot of what we saw in 2019. A lot of #1 issues, a lot of gimmicks, a lot of these kinds of different, temporary one-off events that ultimately have produced in making a lot more comics, but overall selling less year after year. Now, I know that goes in the face of a lot of people who say, no, the comic industry is doing great. And we have to admit, the comic industry is doing great when we factor in everything, when we factor in graphic novels, when we factor in things like what Boom and Image did. And why I look at some of the indies in this picture is a lot of the indies look very stable during this picture. They're not the ones dragging it all down. In terms of monthly comic sales, what's dragging them down are the massive amount of #1s, the interruptions of lines, and the events that aren't selling or basically not creating long-term buyers. If you're a comic fan coming in, where do you even begin with Marvel or DC? Where do you start? It's hard to really know. Maybe Future State and what they're doing in March will help tell that story, but at the moment, it's very difficult for new people to know where to begin. Increasingly, and we can see it from the numbers, they're going to indies, they're going to manga, they're going to YA or OGNs, they're going to crowdfunding, they're going to things that are different because they're easier jumping on points. And because the industry is so buffeted and so weighted by Marvel and DC, when you see monthly comics and you see these declining lines, that's what's going on. Now, fortunately for the bigger comic industry, other people are stepping up. What we've seen from manga, what we've seen from graphic novels and trades and other things. And there is money still flowing into this overall picture. But we do have to admit, it's a very different set of money. It's not the same plan. It's not the same comics. It's not the same overall picture. And so we are, I think, officially, 2019 is the year that a lot of kind of panicky gimmicks were thrown out the door. We saw this dramatic rise in #1 issues and anniversary issues and price hikes and everything else. And I think we can officially call it that 2019 is the beginning of this next 15, 20-year trend in comics where things are going to be very different. And right now, from this particular vantage point, it certainly seems like the future belongs a lot more to the small publishers, people like Scholastic, people like manga. It feels like it's more their game that they're playing. Now, please don't get me wrong. This doesn't mean that Marvel and DC are on the brink and they're about to be, they will be folded or any of that. Not at all. But what it does mean is they're going to have to work harder to maintain their place. They've got real competition. for the first time in quite a long time. And it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. Anyway, this was 2019. I'm going to do 2018 and slowly work our way back because I think the picture is most interesting when you tell it from this direction. There's a lot here. And I'm really curious to see what you make of all this data because I think you can draw a lot of very different conclusions. Interested to see what you think about it. Hey, ask me any questions below. Like I said, there's a lot of data. This is a long video, but I hope you've enjoyed it. Like and subscribe if you don't mind. Otherwise, let's keep looking at this stuff together and figure it out because at the end of the day, we can all like different comics, and we do. You can like something Marvel does, DC does, and Indie does. Everybody's got their own taste. That's all fine. But the more we know about this business, the more I think that we can start to assess what's going on. And it's an ever-growing picture. And I think it's pretty cool. Anyway, let me know any questions you have below. Check the description if you want to reach out to me or anything like that. And most importantly, thanks for listening.